Hello and welcome everybody to our afternoon webinar, depending on where you are, 12 noon Eastern time. Talking to you from Mississauga area in Ontario, Canada. Peter Carson here, and we're going to be chatting on external sharing, what to use when in Microsoft 365. This is actually our first event we're doing on Teams live events. I've done a couple other in different venues, but for webinars, we've in the past always used a different technology. We figured, you know what, we're an all-in Microsoft partner. We should really do our events in Microsoft Teams as well. So still working out some of the details, but I think we've got it going here. I see attendees coming in, so that's great to see. And let's go from there. So let me flip over to my slides here. And quick introduction for those of you who haven't been on one of my webinars before. Peter Carson here, president of Extranet User Manager, also an Office Apps and Services MVP. My contact details are on in here. We're actually recording the session live, so immediately, actually while it's going, anybody can go back in time and record and playback. So if you're late to join, you can start right at the beginning, and as soon as it's over, the link will remain live, and people can come back in and look at the recording from there. So it's pretty cool from that point of view. Okay, so quick agenda of what we want to cover off today. We've got a fair bit. We're going to keep it within the hour, and some of the content's net new here, so I'm going to work on my pacing and make sure that we stick to the schedule and get through everything we want to cover off. We're going to start just with out of the box. What can you do from an external sharing point of view with what Microsoft has provided? And that list has gotten pretty long lately. They've done some really good work over the last couple of years, and that external sharing out of the box, not just in SharePoint, but across the whole Microsoft ecosystem, is pretty rich. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. Can't really talk about SharePoint and external sharing these days without talking about Teams as well, because Teams is the hot thing. Most organizations that are in the 365 space are either all into Teams now because of COVID and everybody working remotely, or they're well along on that journey. And part of that is understanding, well, what are the implications of spinning up Teams, and when should we share those externally, and what about the underlying SharePoint? How do we share documents, folders, sites as part of that? So we're going to delve into that side of it. Then we're going to get into Azure Active Directory B2B, which stands for business to business. That's the underlying technology from the Azure AD team in Redmond that really supports a lot of these external sharing features that we're going to talk about. We'll then switch into portals from external users, building sort of more of what we call a structured extranet, publishing content up into Azure, and then wrap it up from there. We've got some closing points around security and data loss protection and such that we're going to touch on there as well. So a lot to cover. Let's just dive right into it. So there's kind of two styles of external sharing that I want to talk about here. The first is what we call collaborative, and the second is more publishing. And the collaborative is really where we see the out-of-the-box features shining. If you've got a document, let's say Logan and I were actually collaborating on this PowerPoint presentation. He's my sales manager at Extranet User Manager. And that ability to co-author on a document and have a single version of the truth is awesome, not just for working within your organization, but with external people as well. So that idea of an unstructured collaborative workspace, whether it's a single document, it's a folder, or it's an entire site, makes a lot of sense. That can be project focused, it could be task focused. There's lots of different scenarios from that point of view. On the right-hand side, when we get into the publishing model, this is where we get bigger extranets. So you've got sort of a one-to-many structure. You've got a customer portal, a citizen portal, a donor portal. There might be hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of external users in there, and you need a more structured approach to that. You're not going to invite those people in one at a time. You probably want some sort of invitation or self-registration process and onboarding process to make that easier from that point of view. It is typically more a one-way push of private content out. There may be stuff coming back. You may have the ability to like or comment on things that are in there. Maybe there's an area for those people to upload files back in or fill out forms. So a number of different scenarios on that side as well. And there could be profile management as part of that, maintaining more than just what your name is and your email address is, but your broader profile within that publishing portal. So as we're talking to organizations and sort of understanding what they're looking to do from an external sharing point of view, you have a number of questions that we go through with our clients and folks that we're speaking with. So let's just run through those together, and I'll give you some options as you go through there. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, we do have the Q&A open in the live event. Logan and Amanda are going to be moderating that. So if you have questions in there, they'll do their best to answer and highlight those. I'm going to try and take a look back periodically through, and if I want to be able to comment on those as we go through, I will. We'll maybe have some time at the end, or if not, we can follow up with you afterwards to answer those questions. So coming back to the considerations for external sharing, the first, of course, is just who are you going to be sharing with? You know, is it a members portal, a customer portal, board of directors, citizens? You know, there's lots of different scenarios you can think of. You know, in any one organization, you know, may not just have one of these groups. They may have multiple groups, and there may be different structure to those different groups within that organization. Depending on the size of that external group, there may be some member database that we want to interface with. You know, if we're talking about a customer portal, maybe you have a CRM, Salesforce or Dynamics 365 that you want to interface in. If it's a vendor portal or a supplier portal, maybe it integrates in with your ERP system or your finance systems as part of that. You know, volunteers may be part of or donors as part of a donor portal, volunteer portal. So lots of scenarios within that. So coming out of that question, you know, how do people come into your external sharing site? Do you know who all those people are, in which case invitation works really well? Or do you need to allow people to discover themselves and opt into it? You know, you want some sort of self-registration as part of that. So invitation only works really well for a smaller known set of users. Maybe you're building a portal for your board of directors. You know, you hopefully should know who those 12 or 24 or whatever that number of people is, and you can invite them in. Self-registration, maybe it's a citizen portal or a donor portal where you don't actually know who those people are. You want them to be able to self-discover, sign up. Maybe there's approvals, maybe there's auto approvals or delegation around that. You know, lots of different options on rules from that point of view. There's also a piece in between the private registration option where, you know, you can share a link out that allows people to basically go through a self-registration, but they can't self-discover it. They need somebody to tell them about it. It's sort of a, you know, if you tell two friends and they too tell two friends, you can broaden that community out and bring them in, but still manage who's coming in through there. Next, talking more about how your external users are going to authenticate. You know, traditionally we think of extranet portals having a username and a password, or maybe an email and password, and we have to deal with self-service password reset as part of that. There's other ways to do that. You know, the obvious one for this conversation is leveraging what Microsoft's done with Microsoft 365 and Azure AD. Can you leverage the person that's coming in or organizational account in order to do that? In which case, they don't need to know any new credentials. They actually use their own credentials to come in. If that's not possible, maybe they don't have Office 365, they don't have an Azure AD account, you can do what's called a one-time passcode as part of that as well, where basically Microsoft will email a passcode each time they go to authenticate, and it becomes their temporary password. It's only valid for 30 minutes. It's actually a really simple, friction-free way to bring people in. They could use the Microsoft account or Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. You know, there's lots of social federation that you could light up as part of that as well. Then what are they going to be doing when they come in? You know, are they just coming in to access some specific content? Are they going to be collaborating on documents? Do you want them to be full-fledged members of project sites, or maybe full-fledged members of an entire group or a team? You know, can they participate in channel conversations in teams, or can they just collaborate on an individual document? There's different scope and spectrum that you can set up from that perspective. And then kind of related to that, you know, what applications are they going to be using? Is it strictly within the 365 world? Do they need to get into other Microsoft apps, maybe on-premises thing, third-party apps, custom applications that you've built, either on-premise or in the cloud? You know, all of these are possible. You can federate the authentication and provide a nice, rich single sign-on experience through all of that. So let's start with the simple. Let's take a look at what Microsoft's done from an out-of-the-box external sharing point of view, and let's start actually with the sharing dialog itself. They've done a nice job of this. They've given us a number of options through here. Let me actually flip over into my demo tenant, and I'm going to actually take you through that sharing scenario. So if I come over here, and let me actually go into one of these groups. We're going to talk about this scenario a little bit more, but I'm going to use this public group no approval site as an example. Or actually, sorry, now that I think about it, I was going to use my OneDrive as the simple beginning example. So whether you're in OneDrive for Business or SharePoint Online, the same external sharing rules apply through here. And actually, whether you're in the browser or in Windows Explorer, here I'm working against a synced local version of my OneDrive for Business. I actually get that same sharing experience. So let's say I want to share a budget with a client through here. I can right-click on that right in Windows Explorer and choose my share option in here. And I have a number of choices available to me. So I can pull this down and say, hey, somebody already has access. I just want to get a link to it. This is actually my preferred default setting. We'll talk about where you set those in a minute because it doesn't change any permissions. It just gets me a simple link to that document that I can send in a Teams chat or embed into an email or communicate different ways to the people, and they're coming against that document. They're not working with an email attachment, which we're trying to get away from. Or if I have specific people that I know that I want to invite into this, I can choose this option and I can determine, hey, do I want to allow editing or not? I'm going to make it read only, and I can actually block the download on that. So I have a fair bit of control over how people are going to use that document. When I apply this, it'll ask me for the people that I want to share that with. This one here, the people in Envision IT with the link, is kind of a special one. It basically makes it available to everybody in my organization. Now, this excludes any external users, basically any staff. So if I want to share one of my OneDrive documents in this example with everybody in Envision IT, I'd basically choose that option, and I can still define those rules around whether I want to block editing or download as part of that. This top one here actually freaks a lot of people out, this idea of anyone with the link. It's sometimes called an anonymous link because you basically don't need to define who's going to access it. Anybody who has the link can use it. But anonymous is not really the right phrase because you do need to authenticate as part of coming through here. And you can define, again, what the rules are through there. I can say, hey, I want to allow editing or not. This one actually lets me set some additional parameters in here as well. I can say, when should this be valid to? Maybe I just want to make it available till the end of the week, so I can choose October 16th. I can set a password on it. I'm not actually a big fan of this feature. If I set a password, then I need to communicate that password to people, which means I'm probably back to emailing a password, which isn't a very secure way of doing it anyways, and such. Now I can still do the block download on here as well. The way to think about this one, and the way to argue with a lot of security folks why it's actually a good idea to allow this in the right situations, it's basically a more secure way of sending an email with an attachment. If you think about when I send an email to somebody and attach a document to it, basically I've lost control of that document as soon as I email it. They can forward it to somebody else unless I've got some protection on that. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but typically, I've lost complete control over that. And I have no idea who it gets forwarded to and who opens it. If I do this, anyone with a link, it's kind of the same as that, but it's actually a little more restrictive because I can set things like policies around how it can be used, when it expires. I can actually revoke it if I change my mind and say, you know what, I don't want to wait till Friday. I want to disable that link right now. After I've generated it, I can actually go into my OneDrive and remove that sharing and remove that ability from there. But the idea is, you can send this to a group of people and say, hey, it's okay to share this with other people that should see this. You make that decision, share it across, but I still keep control over the document. It's still here in my OneDrive or in my SharePoint site. I can revoke that at any time, and I can define who can do what with that. So I encourage you to think about, I don't encourage this for every type of document, but for the right ones, it actually makes a lot of sense to have that option there. So those are kind of our 4 options that we have through our sharing. So let me come back to my slide deck here. So that's the 4 that I went through here. And if we come back to those questions that I had at the beginning in terms of what type of extranet are you looking to do here, it does restrict the out of the box what you're able to do from that point of view. I mean, you can share with any type of external user. It is invitation only. There's no sort of self-registration or portal around that. We'll talk about how we address those later in the structured extranet side of things. They don't have to use an Office account in order to do that. They can use a Microsoft account. We encourage you to turn on this preview feature for one-time passcode that basically says when I share this document with you and you don't have a Microsoft account or a Google account, because you can actually federate with Google now as well, that you just receive a passcode through your email, and that's how you get in to share with that document. So a couple of different options, fairly friction-free from that point of view. They can have any sort of interactions within that, but it is within the Office 365 spectrum alone. So that's what you can do and the scenarios around it. Let's talk now about how you control that, because you don't want to leave this wide open for every site and everything you do within your organization. So how do you manage it from an administrative point of view? What levers do you have to control that? We actually have quite a number. Now, you control who can do the sharing. You can say, well, everybody in my organization is allowed to share, or nobody is. I discourage the no one. In fact, even the only specific people, the scenario I've seen where this maybe makes sense is you have a group that says, hey, members of this group have gone through some onboarding or training of how to appropriately share. And once they've watched the video and maybe answered a quiz or something like that, and you say, yeah, they're safe to share, then they go into that group and they're allowed to share. Or you just make it available to everyone. Those are sort of the two options that I see making the most sense for most organizations. So that's who can share, but who can they share with, you can also define as well. Are they allowed to do that anyone style sharing that I was showing you? Or can they only do it with authenticated users? Do you want to whitelist specific domains? Or do you want to not allow sharing at all? That's kind of the same as the no one up here. Again, I discourage that one there. Now I'll show you in a minute where you configure these. You can configure them at different levels through the organization, but you can make choices as to what makes sense where. And then what sort of things they can share. You know, can they share anything? Is it only specific sites or only files without sensitive content? And we'll touch on this one towards the end where we get into things like Azure information protection and labeling, where you can label sensitive content and rules can then be applied from a sharing point of view around that. And then lastly, how those links can be used. You know, are they there by default? They're enabled but not defaulted. That's actually the one that I like, where it's shared with existing users who has access. You know, that's kind of the least permissive default, and then you have to explicitly decide to share it more broadly than that. Do you want to set mandatory expirations? Do you want to block the edit links? Do you want to disable it altogether? Again, don't really encourage that last option. So where do you go to actually set all this? There's actually three places you have to go into. You have to go into the Office 365 admin, the SharePoint admin at a tenant level, and then within the site collections themselves. You can do this through PowerShell or through the admin portal. So let's take a minute now and let's actually have a look at the admin portals and go through those scenarios. So let me start at the Microsoft 365 admin. So this is all up sharing. So if I come in here, sorry, I always forget where this one ends up. Logan, jump in, and I'm brain farting here on where I get the global settings for that. You know what?
Peter,
come back later.
Peter, if you jump into policies.
Right, where are policies?
Come back to it in a sec.
Okay, we'll leave that one for right now. Had a stressful morning. I'm not on my game here. Okay, second section is within the SharePoint Admin Center, is to actually do it at the tenant level, but specific to SharePoint. So this is where we come into the policies, and we have an option here for sharing. So this is sort of the setting that you need to set at the tenant level, and you need to make this as permissive as any one site is going to be. So this one frightens people because if you want to use the anyone setting anywhere in OneDrive, you need to set it here to that most permissive setting. And likewise, if you want to use the anyone anywhere in any SharePoint site, you need to set it up at that level there. It doesn't mean that every one of your sites is now shareable with anyone. I'll show you in a minute what that actually means from there. We actually have a fair number of other controls through here as well. So I talked about some of these in the slide. I mean, I can limit external sharing by domain. So I can add either whitelists or blacklists. So maybe there's only 3 domains I ever want to share with. I could actually set that as part of that. Or if I want to exclude certain domains, maybe I don't want public domains like Hotmail, Outlook, or Gmail as part of that. I can do that as well through there too. Actually, I'm just going to take my webcam view off here as well, because I just noticed that you're probably not seeing a full view of the screen. It's a little easier as we get into these smaller screens to zoom in on there. This is where we define who's allowed to do the sharing. So I can define groups that need to people belong to in order to be able to do the sharing. This one here, we actually encourage you always check that you must sign in with the same account that I sent the invitation to. If you don't do that, when you invite somebody, they can forward that to somebody else, and that somebody else could come in as that person. And that's probably not what you you want to do from that point of view. And you probably want to put some restrictions around guests being allowed to share themselves through there. You can actually reforce a verification. So if you want people to re-authenticate X number of days, so if somebody's left an organization and that number of days have elapsed, they don't have access to their organizational email anymore, they're not going to be able to re-authenticate and they're out of your extranet, which is actually a really important scenario. It's a challenge in a lot of extranets where you don't do federation, you have a username and password concept. Somebody leaves an org, you never know that they've left, and their account on your site just stays live from that point of view. So that kind of eliminates that issue from that perspective. So next in here, we can get into the types of links that are created by default. This one annoys me a little bit because my favorite one, which is people with existing access, actually isn't in this list. So I can't set that as an organizational default, but I'll show you in a minute where we can set it on the individual sites themselves. And then whether it's editor view by default, and some constraints around, hey, is there a maximum number of days that they can expire? What things are they allowed to do from there? And other options from here. So there's actually a lot of levers that you have to control as an administrator what's able from a sharing point of view. So let's come back to the important one up here, which is how permissive do you want your settings to be? And you have to remember you need to make this as permissive as possible as you want to use on any individual site. Now what we can do next is go down to an individual site. So let me go into the sites list here. And if I search for that public group site that I was showing before, this public group no approval, go ahead and select that site. And you would think it would be under permissions. It's a little confusing. It's actually under policies here as well. You have to come under policies and edit the external sharing. So basically, this is applying a more granular set of rules on top of what the tenant itself is doing. So if the tenant said you can share with anyone, but I said existing guests only on this site, that's all I can do on this site. The caveat is that this can't override what the tenant does. If the tenant is set not to allow anyone, even if I choose anyone here, it actually won't even let me choose it in that scenario. I can't make it more permissive than the tenant is. I can only make it less permissive. So you have to keep the tenant as wide open as possible and then lock down the individual sites from there. So if you've got internal only sites, maybe you've got management sites or HR sites, it's never appropriate to share anything from those sites. Those ones you should set to only people in your organization, no external sharing at all. So you kind of set your tenant as wide open as you're going to use on any scenario, and then make sure each of your site collections is appropriately set from that perspective. And I'm going to come back to this point in a minute in terms of provisioning and templating and why it's really important to make this part of that process through there. So we've already touched on the shareable links. I showed you the example through Windows Explorer. I get the same experience through the SharePoint interface, through OneDrive, and through Teams as well. So Microsoft's done a nice job of providing a consistent sharing experience. People don't get confused that it's different depending on what tool they're in. Doesn't matter which of these 4 tools you're in, you get the same sharing experience through that. There's actually a cool other feature that I want to talk about. It's specific to OneDrive for Business. I kind of wish it was available in SharePoint sites as well. But basically, if I come back to my tenant here, I don't actually know if I've got it set up on my OneDrive here. I've got too many different OneDrive accounts and all my different tenants. But basically what I can do, actually I did do it here. Yeah, so what I need to do first is just create a folder. And I've already done that. I've created a folder called request files in here. If I select that folder, you see up in the toolbar, I now have this request files option show up. So I can give it whatever name I want for there. We'll just call it demo, say next through there, and I can copy that link. Now I can give that to anybody. I can even post it publicly on my website if I wanted to. So if I come back in here and I open an incognito window, so I'm now not a logged in user, and I go to that link. And I say, hey, Peter's requesting files for demo because that's the name I gave it through there. I can select my files. Let me actually go to that demo documents that I had before. So let me have a quick scan down through here. I'll go into my documents. Let's say I wanted to send up that budget that I was looking at previously. So I've kind of turned the direction around the other way. Now remember, I'm in incognito. I'm not signed in at all. So I have to provide a name. I can put whatever name I want in there. I mean, you can't enforce that people are actually putting a legitimate name in, but hopefully people who are collaborating with you are honest from that point of view. So it's taking the file off my local system and uploading it up in there. And I can upload multiple files through that interface. It's quite easy from that point of view. So if I come back to my request files, we can see a few seconds ago, it took that name that I entered for myself, it prefixed the file and I uploaded, and it's there and available for me. But as the person contributing that, I don't have any visibility to anything that's being put in here. There could be 100 other people that drop documents in there. I don't see them, but as the person who requested them, I've got a nice place to receive those contributions. So another cool feature from an out-of-the-box perspective. So just to kind of recap, some things to think about as you're looking to set up your external sharing. And if your organization has said, you know what, we're just going to turn external sharing off altogether, we're not comfortable doing that, doesn't mean that your users aren't sharing externally. You know, they're going to send email attachments, they're going to set up their own Dropbox account on their P card, credit card. You know, there's lots of different ways to share. And the reality is if you don't support it through what you're doing from a modern workplace and Microsoft 365 point of view, people are going to find their own backdoor and do it anyways. So really think hard about whether you should turn it off altogether. I encourage organizations not to put the appropriate policies in place and make sure that it's set up appropriate. So first off, you know, just figure out all your sharing use cases when you do your organizational level. Because remember, you need to set these settings as permissive as possible as whatever the least permissive scenario you're going to be doing. And that may scare admins in organizations to say, hey, I don't want to do this anyone. You know, most of my sites I'd never want to do that. You still need to do it and then lock all those other sites down. It's got to be opened up and then restricted is the way to do it. So don't be afraid of that any one link. It does make a lot of sense. It just doesn't make sense in all scenarios. So understand those scenarios. Look at the other additional sharing. You know, do you want to whitelist or blacklist domains? You really want to make sure that this checkbox about signing in with the same account is checked. You know, do you want to do the re-authenticate in X number of days? Depends who your audience is and what the content is. You know, if you're doing say a volunteer portal and it's got some general information that doesn't have a high security sensitivity on it, then maybe you're not too concerned from this point of view. But if you're sharing documents with your legal counsel or with your accounting firm and, you know, there's financial statements and contracts and things that are very confidential in there, then you probably want to light it up to a higher level. So back to your use case scenarios, think about that as you're building out these out. You know, enforce a default link setting. I'm a big fan, as I mentioned, of this people with existing access. Unfortunately, you can't do that organizationally, but you can do it on a site-by-site basis. So the really important thing is to think about, you know, how do you want to templatize that process of creating the sites and setting these settings so that it's not something you as an administrator need to do on every site that you're working with. It just happens automatically as part of your process. So think about templatizing that. So that's kind of a good segue into my next topic, which is about Teams provisioning and SharePoint. Teams is the hot topic these days. Everybody's very keen on that, but what's your governance around that and what does that look like? So the one thing to remember is when I create a team in Microsoft Teams, it doesn't stand alone. It's part of what's called a Microsoft 365 group. So that team has an underlying SharePoint team site that gets created as part of that. It may have a planner plan, it has a OneNote, could have forms workspaces. You know, there's a lot of things that get created with that. The really important one is the SharePoint site, that everything I do in files in Teams lives in SharePoint under the hood. Users may not be aware of that, but that's what's actually happening. So when we think about those external sharing features that are turned on, think about how those need to be configured each time a team gets created or each time a team site gets created. So coming back to these settings here, you know, you've got your organizational settings, but more importantly, what are those individual site settings? So we've got a couple of options. We're not going to go into in depth here. We actually have an open source project that we've built over the last couple of years around this specifically, which allows you to provide a request process and then apply templates to that. So actually, if I come back to my demo tenant that I've got here, let me just go back over to my landing site. So we've got a number of web parts that publish out as part of this. One is an actual requests for new sites. So I can come in here and say, hey, I want to do a quick demo team or demo site through there, and I can choose from templates. I can say, well, I just want to do a modern team site and I want to create a team as part of this. And as part of these templates, we let you define actually what are those external sharing options. If you want to do the people with existing access as default, we can bake it into the template, set those rules appropriately. There can be approvals and such as part of that, and all that can hang together quite nicely through there. So I encourage you, you don't have to use our open source, but think about having some sort of process involved in doing that. And likewise, even on the team itself, you have to define what are the guest access rules in Teams itself. Do we want to allow people to come in as guests into Teams? I question whether that makes sense in all scenarios. I mean, the challenge with Microsoft Teams I find today with guests, and I'm a guest in a lot of different teams, including some Microsoft engineering ones, is that it doesn't allow you to easily switch between tenants. So things will be happening in another team that I belong to, and because my Teams client is not in that tenant, I don't see notifications, I don't find out about what's going on, and I tend to miss a lot of things through that. So what we've done at Extranet User Manager when we're working with our clients, we'll often invite them into the SharePoint site and collaborate with them on documents in there. We don't tend to invite them into the team itself. We still rely on email as the go-to communication from that point of view. I'm hoping that'll change in time. There's a tremendous number of user voice votes for features around making guest access easier in Teams, and I'm pretty sure Microsoft is hearing that loud and clear, so they're working on that. I just haven't seen specific plans about when is that going to be changed. I would love to see an activity feed that spans different tenants that I belong to. That would make it a lot easier to manage from that point of view. The other thing I want to mention, we've started working with a partner of ours, Orchestry out in Vancouver. I know Michael Pasaric for years now. He's part of the Office 365 MVP community that I belong to. And they've done an awesome job on building a templating solution around the whole Teams and SharePoint provisioning side. Now, they've just launched their product in the last month or so. They've got a great initial version out there. It doesn't have the external sharing configuration options, I believe, in there just yet. It's part of Michael's roadmap to put that in there. Also, part of his roadmap is to provide webhooks into his process so we can actually extend it as partners and add customizations like that templating around external sharing. So we're keen to see where he's going with that product, but by all means, check it out. He and I did a webinar last month, so there's a recording up on our site on that topic as well. And it deals not just with the creation, it's got a strong process around templating, much richer than what we've done from our open source solution point of view, but also from a usage point of view, providing the dashboards to define existing sites and provide some insights into that. And then the part that we haven't dealt with that he's been addressing is the sunsetting side. All these teams get created, sites get created. What are the governance around retention and disposal? Where is that going? I mean, that's still, for the most part, a future side on the Orchestry side as well, but they're definitely thinking about that too. Okay, so that's all been on the out-of-the-box side. I've been going for a little over half here. I'm going to take a quick breath and sip of water. So Logan and team, is there anything on the Q&A side of things that we want to talk to at this point?
No, we're okay, Peter.
Okay, awesome. So switching gears onto the structured extranets, this is where we've got large numbers of external users coming in. And how do we want to manage that? Typically, invitation only is not going to work well on that. We're going to want some sort of either private registration links or self-registration as part of that. And the business owners may be internal in your organization, or they may actually be external. We've done a lot of projects where, let's say, for example, you've got a trusted set of suppliers, customers, vendors, organizations that you're overseeing that you want to provide access to a portal for. You might want to nominate a sort of a super user within each of those external organizations to say, hey, we're going to nominate you, and now you manage all the users from your organization, because they know best who from their organization needs access to your portal. So understanding that delegation model becomes very important as part of that. Now we're still going to use Azure Active Directory B2B under the hood, which is actually the underlying technology on all the stuff that I just showed you when you're doing sharing links from SharePoint Online or from Teams. that's actually leveraging B2B under the hood. So this is not part of the Office 365 team, it's part of the Azure Active Directory team in Redmond, and they've done some great work around how to provide guest access in. And then the beauty here is that it's completely free for any users coming in through these B2B features to then use certain things in Microsoft 365. So for example, any of the document sharing that I was showing you, or site sharing in SharePoint Online, the Teams external guest access, all of that is completely free. It's not true across the board. If we get into things like Power BI, your guest users actually need a license in their home tenant to access your Power BI dashboards. We get into some weird scenarios like that. Same thing with Dynamics and Power Apps and Power Automate and such. I'll leave the licensing details for now, but bear that in mind. Now, in the past, they used to have what they call this 1-to-5 model, where for every one user that you've licensed for Azure AD Premium features, you could have 5 external users use those features as well. Now, if you don't want to use the premium features, it doesn't matter, because the Azure AD Basic is free and there's no restrictions from that point of view. They've recently changed that model. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But the net is you can invite in as many external users as you'd like, and for the most part, there's no licensing required for those external users. Now, how they come in is going to vary depending on what type of user that you're inviting in. And I touched on this earlier, but basically, if they're existing Office 365 users themselves, it's a really seamless experience. In fact, if I invite you in and you're already signed in to your browser to your 365 tenant, you're not even going to see a sign in. You're just going to come right into my portal that I've invited you into, and it's very seamless. If I haven't signed in, I sign in with my already existing organizational credentials, and it's very seamless there too as well. And that's not just for 365 credentials. If I have a Microsoft account, or I just in general have an Azure AD account, that's all going to work for me. Now, if I don't have an Azure AD account, there's this preview feature now called one-time passcode, and we encourage all of our clients to turn this feature on. It really eliminates confusion. In the past, what happened is Microsoft would create an Azure AD account. They called it an unmanaged tenant for that external user, and they had to then deal with password reset and tracking that, and it got really confusing for people going through that onboarding. They said, forget that. Let's just use a one-time passcode. If I invite you in, you don't have an Azure AD account already, then I'm just going to email you a passcode. It's valid for 30 minutes. Put it in the password field, and away you go from there. It does double duty, because it actually revalidates your users every time they come in to say, do they still have access to that organizational account? Even though this is still preview, Microsoft's actually announced that March of 2021, this is going to be the only scenario for folks that don't have Office 365 or Gmail credentials, that they will have to go through the one-time passcode. So they recognize this is the path forward. We're encouraging people to start doing it right now. The last one's an interesting one. You can actually federate with Google accounts as well. So if you have users who have Gmail email addresses, if you turn on this preview feature, they can actually use their Google credentials just like somebody would use their Microsoft credentials to come in through there. So it's the same seamless experience. The only caveat is it does need to be a @gmail.com. If they're an organization that federated their organizational email domain with Google, and you don't see the Gmail, you see their organizational after the @ sign in their email address, Microsoft doesn't know that that's a Gmail account, and they'll take them through the one-time passcode feature. So just be aware of the caveats around that. So you can do these Azure AD B2B features yourself right through the Azure portal. So you can, excuse me, I can come in and bulk invite guest users right through the Azure portal. I can upload a CSV file from Excel and do that, or I can just hit the plus new guest user and bring in individual guest users from there. The challenge is that this Azure portal is very techy. I mean, your IT department is probably comfortable working in here, but delegating this to a business user is probably a non-starter. For sure, giving it to an external user would be a non-starter from that point of view. So while it's doable in there, it's maybe not the best way to go from there. So let's talk about building portals for those external users. What would that look like? So there's a couple of options here. I mean, you can roll your own. The Graph API that Microsoft provides allows you to do all this guest invitation and all this work. You can use Power Automate or Logic Apps to build workflows around that. We've actually done that. It works quite well. But it is very much a build process. You got to figure out the underlying technology and wire it together. There's two other scenarios, one from Microsoft, one from Extranet User Manager to think about. The Microsoft one is called Entitlement Management, and basically it allows you to create access packages that define who people that join that package, what they're able to do in different groups and applications and SharePoint Online and such. And you can have a portal and onboarding and some customization around that. You can define workflows around the approvals through that. So it's actually fairly similar to our Extranet User Manager product. It used to require Azure AD P1, sorry, losing my voice here, for all your staff, and you had to do the 1 to 5 licensing for the external users. With the changes I'll share with you in a minute, it's actually easier from that point of view. Extranet User Manager, I'll show you what we do. We've got a pre-built portal. We're a lot more customizable and fairly simple in comparison to the Azure AD. Microsoft needs to cover all the scenarios. They've got a fairly complex solution. We've kind of narrowed that down and say, okay, let's just deal with external users only, because entitlement management actually applies to onboarding internal staff as well as external users, and keep it simple from that point of view. So I've mentioned this a few times. Let's dive into this. The licensing around external users. So you still have the 1 to 5 billing ratio in there, but for the most part, it's been replaced by this monthly active users concept. And what this means is that the first 50,000 users that you have coming in, and it doesn't mean you can only invite 50,000 people. It's 50,000 people per month coming in. So it's a pretty big number, and it's a subset of your total user base. So if you have a total user base of 100,000 people, but only half of them come in on any one month, it's basically free to use this from that point of view. And that lets you light up all of the P1 and P2 features for your external users. And so it's $0 at that 50,000 level. It's actually pretty cheap. It's basically 0.4 cents per monthly active user beyond that level there. So you have to have a lot of people before you start running up any sort of significant dollars from that point of view. So I encourage you to look at that. Even if you're not going to use the entitlement management, there's some features we're going to talk later from an Azure AD P1 and P2 point of view that really make a lot of sense to consider as well. So this is where you set up the access packages. You define the entitlement management itself, the access reviews or the workflows that happen with that, things like terms of use and identity management. So like I said, a lot of complexity, which is sort of normal for Microsoft. They can configure it a lot of different ways, maybe a little overkill and overwhelming for a lot of organizations. So let's switch gears and talk about what we do on the Extranet User Manager side. These are a couple of client sites that are using our solution right now, OntarioMD being a good example. So if I go over here into my browser, let me just bring up that OntarioMD site. So this is an interesting one because it's actually a public-facing site as well as an extranet. So most of the content I can actually visit on this site without authenticating at all. But if I belong to their community, which encompasses healthcare professionals across the province of Ontario, the ability to come through a sign-in registration process through here and then access additional apps and such through there. So there's lots of scenarios from that perspective. In fact, let me come back to my demo tenants here. So if I come to my Extranet User Manager landing, this is actually our .NET Core portal that we provide as part of our product. We actually provide the source code for this piece of it as part of the license itself. So you're free to customize and brand it and take it in different directions from that point of view. What this one is showing me here is the ability for people to self-discover groups and try things out. In fact, you can go to this URL yourself right now. You would see the same page that I'm seeing through here. And we've defined public and private groups that are available to be accessed. And the idea is that anybody can discover a public group. A private group somebody needs to tell you about before you can ask to join that. So if I come through here and say, hey, I want to join this public group with no approval, this one actually doesn't require any approval. When I join on that, just takes me right into the site for that group. Whereas this one goes through a workflow process before it allows you into that site through there. Now, before I go ahead and join, when I hit the join group here, it's going to force me to go through a registration and sign in. So I have to identify who I am, and then I can join the group and access it from there. So it's a really easy way to onboard people in. It's kind of similar to the OntarioMD scenario where anybody can register and go through. Now they have specific approval rules around who they let in from that point of view, and that's where those custom workflows come in from that perspective. So on the back side of this, if I come back to my SharePoint landing page here, let me look at some of the web parts that I've got. So I've got a sites list web part that shows me all the sites that I have in my tenant, and we can actually see here's that same site sort of from the content owner's perspective of that public group no approval. So if I jump into that site, here's my SharePoint Online site, and I actually have a web part here that shows me who are all the members for this group. And I can actually right through here invite people in. So rather than having people self-register, I can do an invitation process as part of this as well. Or I can actually say, hey, I want to grab this registration link and just copy this, and I can email it out to people to say, hey, use this link and bring it in through here. If this was a private registration group, I would need to receive this link in order to be able to do that registration. So you can kind of look at your scenarios, understand how you want to communicate that out and publish that, and then build out your groups from there. And then as part of the onboarding process, depending on what rights that group has, they may be able to do certain things in SharePoint, in Teams, in different 365 components from there. Maybe they can just view content, maybe they can contribute, maybe they only have a particular area of the site where they're allowed to contribute. You define with standard SharePoint Teams permissions what they're able to do then from that perspective. I mean, the important thing is that everything we're doing under the hood is actually sitting on top of Azure Active Directory. We're creating groups in Azure AD and managing that whole process through there. So it's very tied in from that perspective. In fact, if I go over into the admin console here, oops. Should have queued this up before? There we go. Okay, so now I'm in our Extranet User Manager admin console. If I come into my group section here, let me search up one of these groups. I'll just look for that public one. So here's that public group no approval that we were just looking at. If I actually open up and edit it, we can see all those rules that define it. So we can see here, hey, does this require approval or not? Well, we said this was a no approval one, so we left that turned off. If it was on, I would define who the approvers for this group was. How does the registration work? Well, we've made it available for registration and we've marked it as publicly available, so it shows up in that anonymous site. If I turn this off, then that group's no longer going to be available to be discovered, but people can still share this registration URL, which was the same one I showed you from in the SharePoint site, out with anybody that registers, and they would still go through the approval if it required from that point of view. This is the actual SharePoint site that it's associated with, the SharePoint group that I'm going to put people in from a permissions point of view. And I've got some details here that I can share with people to explain, from a summary and a detail point of view, before you join this group, what is it and what's going to happen as part of that. So it becomes very easy for a non-IT person to then manage this process, to say, hey, no, I need a whole new site to manage things from here, or maybe you actually bake this in as part of the provisioning process that I was showing you earlier and pull that full circle. I can define the owners in here, so I could actually delegate this out to somebody in my organization who's not in IT, because we really don't want IT to be a gatekeeper in here, or I could even make an external person an owner from that. In that sort of super user external admin scenario, they would then have the ability to manage that group and work with it from there. They may not even need to come into here. They may do everything that they need right within the web part that we have in the SharePoint site in terms of inviting and approving users through there. So you could decide how much you want to share from that perspective. And then we can see the actual membership through here, which is really the same information we're seeing over in the web part here. So a number of ways to manage it from that perspective. Okay, getting close to the top of the hour. So let me flip to my last couple of topics in here. We recently did a conference called Teams Day Online, September 30th and October 1st. And we actually used a lot of this as part of that. We learned a lot of lessons. We had some challenges around user information and privacy. One of the goals that we had in this conference was we wanted people to actually join not just Teams meetings and live events like we're doing here today, but actually join the team itself as an external guest in the tenant and be able to collaborate in channel conversations and things like that as part of that. But the challenge we had was as soon as you invited people into teams, everybody else that was a member of that team saw everybody's information, including their organizational email address and contact information, which is not a good thing from a public conference privacy point of view. So we ended up building a second tenant that we made people members of, and then made that account that we used to mask their identity a guest in the Teams tenant. Net at the end of the day, I'm going to publish an article shortly. This didn't really work out as well as we wanted. It was too confusing for users, and there was too much complexity in there. So we're actually planning another event with the organization where we're just going to bring guests right into the conference tenant itself, but we're not going to try and light up those channel conversation side of things unless people decide, hey, they want to join and they recognize that their information is going to be shared from that point of view. But if all they want to do is join the live events and join the Teams meetings, they can do that safely without sharing their information, and it's fine from that point of view, because we're just going to simplify this a lot and make it much easier. So we're actually doing a webinar for the local SharePoint users group next week, and I'm going to repeat it, I think, the week following as a public webinar really on this topic. So we actually have a number of not just Teams Day Online that we're doing in this way. So stay tuned on that side, sort of how do you run a conference in Teams and leverage the registration and onboarding side of things. So the last piece I want to cover off from a scenario is how do we actually publish things out to Azure? So if we look at scenarios like the OntarioMD one here, where we've got a public-facing website, this is actually an Azure website. So it's not SharePoint Online, it's not Microsoft 365, it's a bespoke website that's built and published in Azure. But all of its content actually comes from 365. So content authors that want to publish up new events and news articles and things like that, they actually do all that work in SharePoint Online. So let's talk a bit about what that looks like. You know, basically you've got a publishing process that as things go through approval steps in SharePoint Online, you can have a workflow that then publishes that up to Azure. And you can build this yourself. I actually did a talk a while back on how you build this logic app and basically use connectors to connect to SharePoint and blob storage in Azure to publish that content up. And that could be anonymously available. It could require authentication on this side, and you can use our Extranet User Manager product or Azure AD natively to provide that authentication. So this is sort of a quick snapshot of what that logic app workflow can look like. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past. We are going to be providing the deck, so you can have a look at that afterwards. You know, and basically this goes through that scenario of, hey, I've done something in SharePoint Online and it showed up in the blob storage from there. We actually have a product called Extranet Publisher, sister product to Extranet User Manager, that actually manages this process as well. And this is showing us how OntarioMD is using it. So their content authors are doing all their work in SharePoint Online from a rich HTML as well as the documents and images upload point of view. Excuse me. And they have multi-step approval processes that they've defined here in SharePoint that, you know, depending on the type of content, it may just go to their communications team for approval. It may go to the business first for approval and then communications. When all those workflows are finished over here, that item is marked as published. That's when our Extranet Publisher picks it up and pushes it over onto the Azure website, and it then becomes available for either anonymous or authenticated users, depending on where that content gets pushed through that. So the anonymous users can come in, the authenticated users come through the Extranet User Manager sign-in to then access that secure content within there. So it provides a nice solution. It's actually how we built the Extranet User Manager website and a number of other websites as well. So we can see here we've got our content in SharePoint Online. You know, we've got all the power of lists to be able to define views and see all the metadata and manage our content through there. And we're actually building a new authoring experience. We found that the HTML web page authoring in SharePoint Online actually isn't that strong. So we're actually going to third-party add-ins to build a richer authoring experience where they can basically edit all the metadata, do the rich HTML editing, you know, save that, check in and preview it, publish it, do all their actions through there as part of the product. So you'll see more on this feature set coming out later in the fall. All right, I got 5 minutes left here. There's a couple of additional considerations that I want to talk on here. The first is around security, and these are some slides I pulled from a Microsoft presentation that they did at RSA conference back in February of this year. They were actually looking at global Azure AD accounts. So not, Microsoft themselves didn't get hacked 1.2 million times, but of the billions of Azure AD accounts, there were 1.2 million compromises in January of 2020, which sounds like a frightening number. I mean, it is a percentage of a decimal of a percentage. It's a fairly small number, but globally, it's still a big number. And we look at underneath the hood, what was contributing to that. 99.9% of those compromised accounts didn't have MFA. Multi-factor authentication, where you have to have something like a passcode on your smartphone or a text message, as well as your password, dramatically improves the security of any system. The other piece is that 99% of password spray attacks, where you've got an account that doesn't require MFA and they just use dictionaries of passwords and they spray them at accounts, and you see this happening all the time. If you look under the hood, probably in your Azure AD tenant right now, they're using the legacy authentication that makes it easier to do these kinds of attacks. So those two things combined have a huge benefit in terms of improving the security of your site as a whole, not just for external users, for your staff too. If you're concerned about the whole password spray and dictionary attacks and things like that, have a look at this site here, Have I Been Pawned? It's both frightening and informing, because you can put your own email address in here, and it'll basically look at historical attacks that they've collected, dictionary attacks that have been publicly made available. You might see that you're in there for LinkedIn or Adobe. There's been some very high profile breaches that have happened over the years. And if you haven't changed your credentials or you share your credentials across multiple different applications, strongly encourage you not to do that, but a lot of people do. This is going to highlight the risk from that point of view. So I encourage you to have a look from that perspective. So one of the things coming back to the Azure AD Premium is that it has obviously things that mitigate that. Now you can turn multi-factor on in Office 365 without having Premium Azure AD. And it'll basically turn it on carte blanche for everybody from your staff point of view. But if you want to get more granular and have some more control over that, you really want to look at lighting up either Azure AD P1 or P2. You get what's called conditional access policies, where you can define rules about when and how MFA kicks in. So it gets more convenient for users, and it also gets more secure in the elevated scenarios. You can kind of balance both ends of that spectrum. You also get a lot of reporting and usage details around that, and you get integration into Azure Information Protection that I'm going to talk about in a minute. P2 of that gives you everything in P1. Really, the way I think about P2 is think about any of the AI features there in the P2 features, and that applies to Azure AD and Azure Information Protection. So if you want things like identity protection, where they're actually aggregating compromises and attacks that are happening across all of Azure AD globally in every tenant, and they're using that to train their machine learning models, and then they're applying those models to your tenant to say, hey, is things that are happening with other organizations happening right now in my tenant, and I should be aware of that, and I should make a password reset required. I should lock this account down. I should alert an administrator about that. That's all Azure AD P2. So there's some pretty cool things Microsoft's doing on that side. The entitlement management that I talked about, creating those access packages in the portal, that's all part of P2 as well. But as I mentioned, for external users, the new licensing features from Microsoft actually make that very cost effective. You'd still need the P2 for your internal staff, but likely not for your external users. Azure Information Protection. This is basically the ability to classify and protect contents. The idea here is that either manually, you can go in and tag content to say, hey, this document is confidential or high security or restricted. You can define what those labels are and what they mean. Or if you use the P2 feature, it can use AI and machine learning to actually look at your documents and say, hey, I see something that looks like a credit card number or a health card number or some personal health information that needs to be treated as confidential, and it will auto label it for you as part of that. And what can happen then, those labels can be used to drive decisions. You can say, hey, who's allowed to do with this, what with this document, depending on what its sensitivity is, how am I allowed to externally share it? All of those policies can be interrelated through there. And you can start to get very granular with your permissions. You can say, hey, they don't just have read-only access to it, but they're not allowed to copy it. They're not allowed to forward it to somebody else. Only the person I shared it with is allowed to open it. So even if they manage to download it and they put it on a thumb drive and they give it to somebody else, that somebody else can't use it because it's still an encrypted document, and you need the original person who's been granted permissions, credentials, to be able to then make use of that document. So it gets to be a very tight way of controlling from a data loss protection and an information protection point of view. So have a look at that if your content is more secure, something I encourage you to explore. So a lot that we've talked about here, we started with the out of the box unstructured, the options in there, things like don't be afraid of the anyone, make sure that you've got some rules around provisioning and templating to set the right policies on the right sites through there, which kind of led into our second topic, into the structured extranets. How do I build portals, self-registration, approvals, things like that? How do I do publishing around those portals? I forgot to add a wrap up here because I added the slides around security and protection as a late addition in there. But of course, bear that in mind as part of it as well. Got a lot of things coming up. I mentioned we're doing a webinar on how to run a Teams virtual event. So we're doing that on October 29th. Actually doing it next week as a local SharePoint users group. It's going to be virtual as well, so you by all means can join that too. We're going to be participating in European Collaboration Summit as part of their networking day. We're going to talk more about this concept of publishing to an Azure website and this concept of a headless CMS, the concept that you separate content from presentation, which is really a big part of where we're moving to on that side there. And then we're actually running a developer bootcamp as part of our SharePoint users group here. It's sort of the topic for this webinar here. So how we run this event as a Teams event is going to be the focus for this prior event through there. So they're kind of interrelated through there. Have a look at our events link here. You've got details for all that information through there. And I'm 2 minutes over. Apologies on that. We'll follow up if there's still outstanding questions from there. As I mentioned, the recording is actually live available through there. We'll publish up the presentation deck shortly onto the event page as well. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind here, a lot of content to throw at you. So sorry if I overloaded with a fire hose, but I hope everybody found value from that, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.